In D&D, there are 4 basic responses that you can give to any given circumstance. You can say no because, you can say no but, you can say yes, and you can say yes and. Each of these responses have their own merits and their own place within the context of the game, and we're going to talk about it. So let's get into it. The basic rule of thumb is that these 4 responses have a destructive tendency from the bottom to the top. The bottom one being most destructive and the top one being least destructive. I'll also be using an example D&D scenario and respond in all of these given ways to give you a better idea of what I mean. Grognak the Barbarian is descending a slope to get to his enemy. The Barbarian wants to get next to the enemy so they can attack them. Let's respond. No because. This is an extremely strong way to respond and should be used in extreme caution. In the context of a game, you want to enable people as much as possible. You do not want to shut them down. This goes from the player and from the DM side of things. So just use this extremely sparingly. However, there are 2 very important instances in which case you would want to use this. The first of which, of course, is to enable the rules that you are playing. If a consistent set of rules are not enabled at your table, then things can tend to fall apart very quickly. So it is important to reinforce those rules and keep everyone to it, yourself included. Everyone should be adhering to the rules that they agreed to before the game started, ideally, but things come up during the game, of course. And no is a perfectly reasonable response to enable this rule. In the example, the Barbarian only has 30 feet of movement and the enemy is 35 feet away. So the Barbarian cannot reach them. This would be a perfectly reasonable way for the DM to respond if they wanted to hard enforce everyone's movement speed. The other reason to say no, of course, is if it crosses a personal boundary. If a situation in the game starts to become extremely personal and take you out of the experience, it can be a very troubling and sometimes traumatizing experience. So saying no and setting a personal boundary is also a perfectly valid reason to say no. In this example, let's say that the enemy that the Barbarian chasing was a child, and you do not want to have child violence in the game. So regardless of whether or not the rules say you are not comfortable with harming children, so the Barbarian cannot hit the child because that is a personal boundary that is being crossed. Moving on. No, comma, but. This is what you should be saying 99% of the time you say no to something in D&D, because it gets the point across while also acknowledging and enabling that their agency is just as important as yours and you want to reach a middle so that there's a compromise that can be had. Or to put it another way, no but should be used to modify a behavior in game that leads to a compromise of some sort. Let's go back to the example. Grognak is running at their enemy that is 35 feet away. They ask the DM, can I make it there? The GM responds, no, but you can use your dash action to slide down the slope and knock their feet out from under them and trip them. It won't be an attack, but you will still have some effect on your turn. A great middle ground that compromises the GM's rulings to the player's agency. On to the next. Yes.
Yes.
This one is the most straightforward of them all. You are just agreeing or affirming something that is happening at the table. In the case of the example, Grognak is 30 feet away and the enemy is 35, and the GM decides to be lenient and say, yeah, I know it says 35 feet away on the map, but I'm gonna let you do it anyway. A perfectly valid response because you want the players to be able to do what they want to do on their turn. However, it is not 100% superior because in this case you are setting a precedent to something, and consistency is key in D&D. Whatever yes responses you give in-game, especially if they're an exception to the rules, you should remain fairly consistent. So in the case of modifying a ruling or the way that you handle a certain social situation or mechanic, regardless of what's happening, if a player or a GM says yes to a situation and a similar one sets up, I think it is fair to say that a precedent has been set based on the previous yeses that have happened in the context of this campaign or game that you are playing. So in the case of the example of your players fighting on a slope, you better be prepared to give them extra movement speed every single time they're fighting on a slope because that's the fair thing to do. At least generally the fair thing to do. Yes and. This is probably the most fun and engaging response that you can give to a situation. Not only does it acknowledge and agree to a given circumstance, it also encourages it and enables it and adds to it. It lends itself to a sense of progression and, in my personal opinion, play. Probably better than any of the other responses even combined. So in the case of the example, not only is Grognak able to reach their enemy that is 35 feet away, but their attacks have advantage and get increased damage because of the increased momentum that they had having the slopey, walky, runny thing that's going on happening. What the fuck am I saying? Basically, the action is encouraged and enabled, and this is a really great feeling and should be done as much as humanly possible because everyone likes to feel heard and acknowledged, and honestly, That's the way that you play with people, is that you take where they're standing and you meet them there. And then if they do the same thing to you, you just keep building each other up until eventually when the session is at its end, you've all built up each other so much that you leave feeling energized, you leave feeling good. And that is the beauty of D&D and should be the goal of most sessions that you play. Now that there's a little more context to each of their phrases, here is my basic goal for any game that I play in terms of distribution and what I respond to. I'm aiming to say no because 5% or less of the time. I'm aiming to say no but 20% or less of the time. I'm aiming to say yes roughly 30% of the time. And I'm aiming to say yes and 50% of the time. And every player is different, every GM is different, every table is different, and the dynamic heavily affects things too, but this is just generally a number that I try to go for in the games that I mostly GM because I'm a forever GM. Oh, woe's me. But hopefully in understanding these responses, you can take them into your next game and make it a more positive experience for everyone. Thank you so much for watching. You're fucking awesome. Until next time, cheers.